Yes, Prabhu, we see your screen.
Do you see my the dedication page?
Yes,
Yes.
Prabhuji.
Yes.
Fantastic. I have a Mac laptop and sometimes it just does weird stuff. Okay. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Tanamane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharane Nirvashe Shunyavadi Pashtatai Deshatarane Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I think I accidentally, Nartanalas Prabhu, turned off the screen control. So for some reason, I need to figure out where the got so many windows open. I want to turn on my video, but I'm not able to see that screen. Okay, here goes. Does that work?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay, thank you. Behind the floating control. Okay. So today I was going to speak about deities and how to understand about deities. I'm not a pujari, so I don't have that intimate experience of serving the deities, but I thought I'll just speak about it given the relevance of today's gathering at the temple with the deity darshan and kirtan. So Srila Prabhupada indicates the importance of this activity if we look at the dedication to the Krishna book. He says, "To my father Gaur Mohan De, a pure devotee of Krishna who raised me as a Krishna conscious child from the very beginning, raised me as a Krishna conscious child." So how did he do that? He encouraged Srila Prabhupada to play mridang. He gave Srila Prabhupada Radha Krishna Vigraha to worship, and he gave me, Jagannath Rath Yatra to duly observe. He was kind to me, and I imbibed from him the ideas later on solidified by my spiritual master, my eternal father, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj. So Srila Prabhupada, his father, in the very beginning of his life, showed him how to chant the holy name and to serve the deity of the Lord and to remember the Lord's pastimes, right? So we can see the importance of each of those components. So this is very important, serving the deities especially in our sampradaya. So there's a website called ISKCON Deity Worship Ministry, and here's a beautiful photo, Shrimati Radharani Ki Jai. So you can see this here. Srila Prabhupada will say something very beautiful. He will say, this is a very important business, deity worship. More the deity is decorated, more your heart will be decorated with Krishna consciousness. So they go hand in hand. The idea is the deities reciprocate. And the more we serve the deity, the more the heart will be decorated by the presence of the deity. So it's a very important instruction. So I thought I would go over, there's this instruction in Canto 3 by Kapil Dev to his mother, Devahuti. So for those of you that don't know, and by the way, this canto, especially this chapter, the chapter 25, has a lot of super famous verses that Srila Prabhupada quoted, this one and the next chapter. So when Kapil Dev is on his earthly Leela, he's not different than manifestation Lord Sri Krishna. His mother and father were Kardama Muni and Devahuti, very elevated uh, devotees, great devotees, of course, to have the Lord as their son. But when Kardama Muni left the family, he showed the example of what a devotee does. That left Kapil Dev and Devahuti in what's currently called Bindu Sarvar near Bhubaneswar, uh, Puri. And Devahuti, in a very unassuming way, although she is such an elevated Vaishnavi and the mother of the Lord, she says to Lord, she says, what kind of devotional service is worth developing and practicing to help me, easily attain the service of your lotus feet? So the idea here is that no one knows more than the Lord himself. So he's the greatest of all. And he's also the master of the Vedas, as we know from Bhagavad Gita. And to hear about him, from him, is actually the greatest benefit for us. So that's why Srila Prabhupada would say the Lord is known as Govinda, because he gives pleasure to our senses. And he gives pleasure to our senses, not just by his pastime, but by his instructions. And that's why when we read Gita and we hear it many times, it gives us great pleasure. The more we read the Gita, the greater the appetite to read and understand it. You find like each time you get new enlightenment. So it's not a static thing, because the Lord is reciprocating and giving us instruction, and therefore we get pleasure out of that instruction, because the Lord's nature is Govinda, one who gives pleasure to our senses. So Devahuti asks him what kind of devotional service is worth developing and practicing. And although she's such an elevated soul, she says, I'm a woman. It's very difficult for me to understand that's the truth, because my intelligence is not that great. Now that's her humility. The acharyas say that the humility of a pure devotee is our reality. We think we're very intelligent, but we're not. But a great devotee like Devahuti, how to say, just call her devotee. She's the emblem of devotion. Is saying this, then what about us? And hearing her humility, Kapil Dev became compassionate, because she was born in a form of a woman, and she was making the mention that because of that, she has some limitations. Of course, like I said, that's her humility. Srila Prabhupada always distinguished between the general population and a Vaishnavi. A Vaishnavi, a Mataji, is as good as a Vaishnava Prabhu. Depends totally on their level of surrender and submission. So the verse I particularly wanted to go over was this one. So he explained, she asked, what kind of devotional service would be feasible for me? So then the Lord starts, Kapil Dev in this chapter and chapter 28 has some tremendous descriptions of how to have darshan, how to appropriately have darshan of the Lord. So he says here, Pashyanti te me uchirani ambasata santaha prasana vaktruna lochanani rupani devyani varapradani sakam vacham spranayam vadanti. O my mother, my devotees always see the smiling face of my forms with eyes like the rising morning sun. We were reading from Bhagavatam today about Bhishma Dev's prayers about how Bhishma Dev appreciates the Krishna's eyes. They like to see my various transcendental forms, which are all benevolent, and they also talk favorably with me. Look at this. All benevolent, and they also talk favorably with me. So kind of get into that. That's very interesting. So, Srila Prabhupada has some wonderful instructions here. He says, Archa, he says that directly worship the personality of Godhead is Archa incarnation. So this, just mark this down, and if you have a place where you take down important sections of Bhagavatam, this gives a devotee some strong argument to understand, to explain to others how this is the form of the Lord. So, that's why I picked this verse. So I'll just highlight this section. So Srila Prabhupada says, devotees directly worship personality of Godhead in his Archa incarnation. Archa refers to the form which we can worship in our present condition. He's saying in our present condition, meaning we have material eyes, right? So we don't have spiritual. Actually, in our present state, it's not possible to see God in his spiritual form because our material eyes and senses cannot conceive of a spiritual form. We cannot even see, look at this point that Srila Prabhupada makes. We cannot even see the spiritual form of the individual soul. When a man dies, we cannot see how the spiritual form left the body. That is defect of our material senses. In order to be seen by our material senses, the Supreme Personality of Godhead accepts a favorable form, which is called Archa Vigraha, sometimes called the Archa Incarnation. It is not different from him. Just as the Supreme Personality of Godhead accepts various incarnations, he takes on the form of made out of matter, clay, wood, metal, and jewels. So, if when we have somebody coming new to Krishna consciousness and they're trying to understand, how's this material form God? We can explain to them that within matter is form, and give the example of how when the soul leaves the body, we cannot even see the soul. So how do we expect to, with our current material vision, have that sense of the presence of God? So, and then Srila Prabhupada says some very powerful stuff in here. Another strong explanation. If God is all pervading, then he's also in material elements. There's no doubt about it, but the atheist thinks otherwise. Although they preach everything is God, he's talking about impersonalists. When they go to temple and see the form of the Lord, they deny that he's God. That's an interesting statement. Somebody who is an impersonalist believes that everything is God, but when they go to a temple, they don't see God. According to their own theory, everything's God. Then why is the deity not God? Actually, they have no conception of God. So the devotee's vision is different. The vision is smeared with love of God. As soon as they see that the Lord in his different forms, the devotee becomes saturated with love, for they do not find any difference between the Lord and his form in the temple. The smiling face of the deity in temple is beheld by the devotees as transcendental and spiritual, and the decoration of the body of the Lord is very much appreciated by the devotees. So you see, the point is, Srila Prabhupada is making that if we understand that everything is God, then why can't God not be in the form of a statue made out of clay, made out of metal, made out of wood, made out of sand, etc., made out of jewels, right? So, Neil Child, the form of Lord was in jewel before he manifested as Jagannath. So, and then I want to highlight this portion where he says, the Lord Kapil Dev says, and he's Bhagwan himself says, that these forms are, my various transcendental forms are all benevolent, and they also talk favorably with me. Have you ever tried talking to the deities? It's really wonderful. Try it. So Srila Prabhupada says there's something very nice. The devotees express their minds before the deity, and in many instances, the deity also gives answers. But one must be very elevated devotee in order to be able to speak with the Supreme Lord. Sometimes the Lord informs the devotee through dreams. These exchanges of feeling between the deity and devotee are not understandable by atheists, but actually the devotee enjoys them. So Kapil Dev is explaining how devotees see the body and face of deity and how they speak with them in devotional service. Do any of you try to have conversation with the deity sometime? Yes? No? Do you ever speak to Shishinatai Sacinandana? No? Haribol, can
Yes,
people hear me?
Prabhu, I have.
Yes?
Yes.
Do you find that he reciprocates with you?
Uh, Not yet, but then I feel so much better after pouring out all my thoughts and uh,
Hmm.
feelings. But I know he's
Yeah.
listening, of course. Yeah.
Yes. Srila Prabhupada does say that it requires some elevation in consciousness, but how do you get elevated? By doing the process, and you're doing the process, right? So there's an example of this that Srila Prabhupada's sannyas spiritual master, Bhakti Pregnant Keshavi Maharaj, Goswami Maharaj, uh, mentions, he says that Supreme Merciful Lord, Sri Krishna, is showing causeless mercy to conditioned living entities eternally in two forms: in material world, the form of the deity and the form of the holy name. So he says that. And he gives this wonderful example. So there's a pastime that a lot of you have heard of, the pastime of Shakshi Gopal. Yes, so very famous pastime, very famous deity. So Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was, traveling, and so Nityananda, and he was in great ecstasy upon seeing the deities of the Lord, and then uh, Lord Nityananda had told him about this story of Shakshi Gopal, and he told it for the great pleasure of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So he explained that in South India, in Vidyanagar, there were two Brahmins, an older one and a younger one, and they wanted to go to uh, Mathura and then ultimately to Vrindavan. And they did. They traveled, and this was in the old days, so there wasn't train or airplane or bus or even auto rickshaw. They traveled. And there was a wonderful temple of Gopal, Shakshi Gopal, uh, etc. And when they had traveled, the older Brahmin had said to the younger man that you've rendered so many types of service and you've assisted me in such wonderful ways while we went to pilgrimage. And because of you, I did not become fatigued while on this tour. Therefore, I promise to give you my daughter in charity. And the younger man said, you know, you're very elevated and rich, and I don't have such wealth, so I'm not really a suitable husband for your daughter. And that in particular, I performed service for you for the pleasure of Krishna, because Krishna is pleased when one serves the brahmanas. And as a result, one's own devotional service increases. So the man said, "Don't doubt me. Don't doubt me. I'm sincere in my instruction." So they went back to Vidyanagar, and I won't go over this whole chapter, but they went back to Vidyanagar, and eventually the elderly Brahmin came back. I can kind of scroll down to it. So if you are trying to read, they each went to their own home. After some time, the elderly Brahmin became anxious that I've given my word to this younger Brahmin in a holy place. I promised has to pass because the Lord was there. So I must disclose this to my wife and my sons and other relatives. So he called a meeting and told them about what happened, and they all heard, and they all agreed that if you offer your daughter to a degraded family, meaning this younger poor man, then your aristocracy be lost. And so the elderly Brahmin said, well, how can I, reverse the promise I made? I must give. And so they said, if you give your daughter to that boy, we'll give you up. His mom and his wife and kids said, we'll take poison. He said, and so the elderly Brahmin, because he had faith, he said, if I don't give my daughter to the young Brahmin, he'll call Gopalji, and thus, I will lose my religious principles. And then the son said, well, the deity is a faraway place. How can he come to bear witness? Why are you so, anxious about this? You don't have to deny that you spoke a thing. Simply say that you do not remember what you said. So this is not being straightforward. Simply say, you do not remember what you said. So a quality of a devotee is Sharalata. They speak consistently with what they feel. There's not a separate thing. If you say, I don't remember, then I shall take care of the rest. By my argument, the son said, I'll defeat this young Brahmin. But the elderly Brahmin didn't feel so good, but he said, okay, you know, uh, he prayed to Gopal, Shachi Gopal. I've taken, at that time he was just called Gopal. I've taken shelter of your feet and I ask you to protect my principles from this disturbance. And yet at the same time, I don't want my family to die. So the young poor Brahmin eventually came to his home and said, you promised to give your daughter to me in charity. Now you don't say anything. What's your conclusion? And the elderly Brahmin remained silent. And his son came out to beat the young man and said, who are you? You're just like a dwarf who wants to catch the moon. How can you marry my sister? So the young Brahmin left. And so people in the village gathered and heard. And the young Brahmin came and said, this elderly man had promised to hand over a daughter. Please ask him about his behavior. And they did. So, the village in the olden days, the village had a council. I forget what that's called, but and they asked him, you promised, why aren't you fulfilling? And he said, and the old man said, I don't exactly remember making that promise. So, and then the son, like he said, he would kind of manipulate everything once his father said that. And so the son, kind of went on and said like some nonsense, like how the younger Brahmin had given some sort of, drug to his father so that made the father mad, and et cetera, et cetera. So you really can't judge. This is not valid. And, and that this young Brahmin was just motivated by money. So the young Brahmin said, well, this is not true. And then, so I'll go down here. And he recalls the past time that he asked the older Brahmin to speak the promise before Gopal. And so that happened. So, he said, the elderly Brahmin said that if Gopal personally comes to serve as a witness, now remember, Gopal is in Vrindavan. This is in Vidyanagar. The two Brahmins are in a village in Vidyanagar. If he personally comes, I will surely give my daughter to the young Brahmin. So the son thought, this is not going to happen. That statue is not going to come here. And so the young Brahmin made the old Brahmin write it down on paper about his new promise. And so the young Brahmin said, after all, the Lord is merciful, and if he likes, he can come. So this is about, the deity form and how he reciprocates and how he speaks. And so he prayed to the Lord that you're protecting Brahminical culture, you're very merciful. Show your mercy by protecting religious principles. I'm not thinking of becoming happy to get the daughter as bride. I'm simply thinking Brahman has broken his promise and giving me pain. Therefore, be a witness. Be a witness in this case. And Gopal replied, go back to your home, call a meeting, and just try to remember me. I shall certainly appear at that time, and I'll honor both you and Brahman by bearing witness to the promise. Because the elderly Brahman had good nature. He was just being forced by his family by threats that he just say, I don't remember making this promise. Don't say you didn't make the promise. Just say, I didn't remember. Then the young Brahman said, well, if you appear as a Vishnu four-armed deity, no one will believe in your words. You think you're just stone, right? Like the vast majority of the world does. Only if you come in this form of Gopal and speak the words from your beautiful face, will your testimony be heard by all the people? Bhagavan Gopal said, I've never heard of a deity walking to place, but so this is the thing that Srila Prabhupada's sannyas spiritual master said. This verse here, Pratima nahi tumi shakshad brajendra nandana. So this is what the young Brahmin said to Gopal. He said, you're not a statue. You're directly the son of Maharaj Nanda. You know, so you're directly the son of Maharaj Nandana. So we all know what happened. You know, the Gopalji followed, and he said, "I'll walk behind you." You know, when the young Brahmin prayed like that to the deity, Gopal, he said, "I'll walk behind you, and I shall go. But don't try to see me by turning around, because then I'll remain fixed in that one spot. You will know that I'm walking. You will hear my ankle bells, and just offer me some nice bhoga." And so they started from Vrindavan all the way to Vidyanagar. I don't know how long distance that is, but I would think it would take months and months. And so the young Brahmin served the Lord as best as he could. And then they eventually came to their village, and you know, the young Brahmin became kind of worried that if people don't see the Gopal deity, they wouldn't believe that he had arrived. But if the Gopal stays here, there's nothing to fear. So he thought that, and he turned around and saw Gopal, and he saw he was that Gopalji was standing there. And the Lord said, "Okay, because you turned around and looked at me, I won't follow you anymore." You know, because that was the exchange between Gopal, the Lord Gopal, and the Brahmin. And so the Brahmin went to the town and said, "Okay, you know, Gopalji has arrived," and all the villagers came and saw him, and they were very pleased. And the elderly Brahmin also came and saw, wow, you know, the deity has come, but the deity is exactly of Gopal and Vrindavan. He's not like a four-handed Vishnu form, etc. So then the Lord started speaking. Gopal started speaking, "You are my servants, birth after birth, and I'm very pleased by truthfulness of both of you. Now you can ask for benediction." And so they both said, "Please remain here so that all the people will know how merciful you are to your servants." And so Gopalji stayed, and then he, you know, explained that yes, indeed, this happened. And Vanmali Prabhu has probably seen this form. So this is actually Shakshi Gopal, you know, in I think it's very close to Bhubaneswar and Katwa. So so this is the form of the Lord that bore witness. So, you know, Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master had instructed Srila Prabhupada that actually, you know, the Lord's mercy is that he shows his presence in the material world in two manners: one in his deity form, and one in his holy name. And therefore, in this particular example that he used, you can see that he's directly the son of Nanda Maharaj. So Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, you know, as a result of all this, uh, did say that Sadhu Sangha Nam Kirtana Bhagavad Shravana Mathura Vashi Murtiraya Shraddhaya Sevana. So these are the five most potent forms of devotional service. One should associate with devotee, Sadhu Sangha. One should chant the holy name, Nam Kirtan. One should hear the Srimad Bhagavatam, reside in Mathura or other places of residence of the Lord, and that worship the deity with faith and veneration. You know, he doesn't just say worship the deity, he says with faith and veneration. That's very important. So, so let me open up. So coming back to, so I said all this to, you know, this part where Srila Prabhupada says that devotees, because here Kapil Dev says to Mother Dehavuti that all my forms are benevolent and they also talk favorably with me. They meaning the devotees. And Srila Prabhupada says here, devotees express their mind before the deity. In many instances, the deity also gives answers. So This is why I went back into the Shakshi Gopal pastime to explain this statement made by Srila Prabhupada. Hmm. So I can go to the next one. So this verse, going back, was that my devotees always see the smiling face of my form with eyes like the rising morning sun. They like to see my various transcendental forms, which are all benevolent, and they also talk favorably with me. Next verse is also very often quoted by Srila Prabhupada. He spoke beautifully about this in Mumbai. So, upon seeing the charming forms of the Lord, smiling and attractive, and hearing his very pleasing words, the pure devotees almost loses all other consciousness. His senses are freed from all other engagements, and he becomes absorbed in devotional service. Thus, in spite of his unwillingness, he attains liberation without separate endeavor. Now, this is spiritual liberation, not some other materialistic liberation that the Lord Kapil Dev is talking about. So he's saying, upon seeing the charming forms of the Lord, smiling and attractive, that in spite of the devotee's unwillingness, he attains liberation without separate endeavor. Srila Prabhupada has just like for the verse 35, 35 was a great commentary on how the Lord can be in material form, and to prove that by using the example of how when the soul leaves the body, we can't see that, but then why do we deny that the Lord, at the same time we say Lord is everywhere, so why can't he be in the material form? We just cannot see it because we don't have the consciousness of a devotee. So here's some beautiful things Srila Prabhupada says in this purport. Simply by seeing the beautiful decoration of the deity in the temple, the devotees become absorbed in thought of him and lose all of the consciousness. Simply by fixing oneself in Krishna consciousness, engaging the senses in the service of the Lord, one is imperceptibly liberated. Imperceptible. Perceptible means to perceive, to get that sense of, oh, this is happening. Srila Prabhupada says imperceptible, liberated. So it's like when I ask whether any of you speak to the Lord, Shishnatha Sacinandana and Anita Mata, and whether they hear the Lord, and Anita Mata said, I do speak to the Lord, ask him, say, reveal my heart, etc., but don't necessarily hear his response. So Anita Mata hears Srila Prabhupada and the Kapil Dev himself saying that it does occur, even though you may not, feel it, but your consciousness will get absorbed in this exchange. It's like Narottam Das Prabhu has a little baby, and I'm sure from very birth, he's and Mataji spoke to the baby. Oh, even though, can the child really understand the words? No. But the child can understand the consciousness behind that speech of love, unrequited love, complete surrendered love. And the child will reciprocate. And as a result, the relationship between parents and child would develop, right? Correct, Narottam Das Prabhu? If you're still there, I know you were going to go to the temple. So, this can happen. And we see that in day-to-day life. Now, Srila Prabhupada points out that in addition to darshan of the deity, however, there's something else very important. Like if you look at this verse, Vilas Asikita Vama Shuktahi, that Vilas, you see the form of the Lord, but Srila Prabhupada says here, the word vilas is very important. Vilas refers to activities or pastimes of the Lord. It is a prescribed duty in temple worship that not only should one visit the temple to see the nicely decorated deity, but at the same time should hear recitation of Bhagavatam and Gita. It is a system in every temple. There's recitation of Shastra, right? So, so Srila Prabhupada is mentioning the importance of this joint process of the form of the Lord and hearing about the Lord and chanting about chanting the glories of the Lord. So, his he says, in this way, Their minds may always remain absorbed in the thought of the Lord, His form, His activities, and His transcendental nature. This state of Krishna consciousness is the liberated stage, even though it may be imperceptible to us. By seeing the form of the Lord, hearing Bhagavatam, Gita, chanting, Kirtan, this is imperceptible liberation. So, so so Prabhupada in his comment in Mumbai emphasized this word, anachato me gatim anvim pakunte. Unwillingly, such a person comes to my abode. So he said, simply by seeing, if you hear about Krishna, just as you're hearing from Srila Prabhupada's translations right now, I'm just, incapable medium, but you're hearing from Srila Prabhupada's words. Just by hearing, Srila Prabhupada said, these two processes will increase in such a way, seeing and hearing, that at one time, anichato me gatem anu pravyukante, you'll automatically become a great devotee. So, the idea is the Lord is in his form as deity is present, and he can speak to us when we have appropriate consciousness when we see him, and that we may not hear it, just like we may not actually see the presence of the Lord and the deity, but that exchange itself will allow our consciousness to develop. So, we know that not just for deity worship, but the performance, any type of devotional service, you cannot do without the help of chanting of the holy name. And it's particularly in this age of Kali. Therefore, you will see that pujaris on every aspect, like offering flowers to the Lord, or when asking the Lord to take rest, and the Mangal Artik in the middle of the day, Raja Bhoga offering at the end of the day after Sandhya Arti, putting Lord to rest. The chanting of the holy name is always present, right? You see that all the time. And that's because it's explained that material creation begins from Shabda, or sound. That's what's called Shabda. The highest authority is Shabda Brahman. So, why? Because material manifestation and the elements of material manifestation are present within sound. That's why the Shastra scriptures say that there's sound in ether, sound in air, etc. Now we cannot see, while I'm speaking, you cannot see the sound itself, right? It's invisible. But our scriptures explain that the sound creates invisible vibrations, and that eventually take shape or form. And those of you that have heard classical Indian music, this is commonly understood. Like the idea is in classical Indian music, the rags, etc., and the melodies, within them, they're supposed to be gods and goddesses, devis and devatas, residing within them, right? And that these melodies have power because they can invoke those devis and devatas by the melody itself. Like there's a very famous raga called Basanta Rag, and it's usually sung in spring. So the idea is that when somebody plays that melody or chants in that melody, they can see the form of Lord as Cupid with flowers in the sky. So sound within itself carries the shape of form, and you can see this even in I guess kind of like a more day-to-day term. For example, somebody calls you. They leave. Everybody has what sound specialists call, like when we work with audiologists in our specialty, like hearing specialists. Everybody has like a specific voice fingerprint. It's very unique. So you can understand that when somebody calls you, that such and such person is calling you, and you can identify them. As soon as you hear the sound of your friend's voice in the telephone, you can immediately identify, oh, this is so and so, this is Anita Mataji, this is Amali Prabhu, this is Paramakana Prabhu, etc. So form manifests in our mind as soon as the sound is heard, and then that when it manifests in our mind, it goes eventually towards our consciousness. So this, I'm just trying to explain by the example of like a phone call, an example of hearing particular ragas and how the devatas manifest within that how the relationship between sound and form. And this is particularly relevant in the process of chanting, of course, because just as material sound in the form of somebody calling us over the phone produces a visible form to our consciousness, similarly, the transcendental vibration of Krishna's name produces a form of Lord Krishna within one's heart. And that's what Srila Prabhupada was referring to in the prior verse. And in this verse, that imperceptibly that occurs, meaning it occurs on a plane of consciousness, not necessarily plane of the gross body. So there's a really nice way to understand how this can occur, how sound and form are linked, and how absorption in something changes our perception. Okay, and so this is in this in Canto 11. There's a section about a very famous personality called Avanti Brahman. So, he's explaining how the birds and the bees, etc., have become his gurus. He was rejected by society and by his own family, and then he came to understand that he's not suffering because of them; it's actually himself. So he says something very powerful. He gives examples to various animals, but this is particularly relevant. He says, if out of love, hate, or fear, an embodied soul fixes his mind with intelligence and complete concentration upon a particularly bodily form, he will certainly attain the form that he is meditating upon. And Srila Prabhupada, or the purport provided by Srila Prabhupada's disciples, is wonderful. From this verse, it's not too hard to understand that if one constantly meditates upon the Supreme Person of Godhead, one will achieve a spiritual body. With such complete absorption of consciousness, surely one will attain the next form of form exactly like that upon which one was meditating. Meaning, if you're meditating by both the form of darshan and by the form of chanting on the Lord, then next life will be in that form. And so the Avanti Brahman gives a beautiful example of how that is the case. And he does that by talking about the example of a wasp. So this is being, of course, spoken by Shukadeva Goswami, but he's retelling what Avanti Brahman said. He says, O king, so Avanti Brahman was speaking to a personality, that once a wasp forced a weaker insect to enter his hive and kept him trapped there. In great fear, the weak insect constantly meditated upon his captor, and without giving up his body, he gradually achieved the same state of existence as a wasp. Thus, one achieves a state of existence according to one's constant concentration. What a beautiful example, right? What a beautiful example Shukadeva Goswami is relating. So, Srila Prabhupada says this. He says, since the weaker insect in the story did not physically change, or his disciples say this because Srila Prabhupada didn't write the commentary. Since the weaker insect in the story did not physically change his body, how can it be said that he achieved the same state of existence as the wasp? Actually, by constant meditation upon a particular object, one's consciousness becomes filled with its qualities. Due to extreme fear, the small insect was absorbed in the characteristics of the large wasp and entered into existence of wasp. And so in the next life, we'll take the body. We know this from the example of Bharat Maharaj, etc. Right? So, this is example of what's called here. Let me see which version. Let me just pull this up. Yeah, so Kapil Dev mentions this here, and Srila Prabhupada expounds on. This is in chapter 26 of Canto 3. He said the first thing produced, which is subtle form of, the first thing produced was sound, right? We talked about this. It's said in the Vedanta Sutra, sound is the origin of all objects of material possession, that by sound, one can also dissolve his material existence. By sound, one can dissolve this material existence. Anavritti Shabdat means liberation by sound. The entire material manifestation began from sound, and sound can also end material entanglement if it has a particular potency. The particular sound capable of doing this is the transcendental vibration Hare Krishna. Our entanglement began with material sound. Now we must purify that sound in spiritual understanding. So, very wonderful statement by the Avanti Brahmin and by Srila Prabhupada. So, the idea here is that taking shelter of Krishna's holy name, one will perceive the darshan of Krishna's form imperceptibly. It will go from being a material form made out of wood or marble, and if that act of darshan is accompanied by the act of chanting the holy name, the act of hearing and remembering Bhagavatam and Gita, then that sound will bring us form. So I don't have this in a form that I can display, but I wrote it down from Harinam Chintamani, which is this book here. Beautiful. I particularly like this edition because it has all the verses, and it has explanations. So, you can kind of look at it, highlight it, read it, whatever. So this one's a really nice one. But there are quite a few versions, and there are even some free ones I think you can get through ISKCON Desiree. Okay, Harinam Chintamani. So in chapter 2, I can't display it because I don't have it in a form that I can cut and paste right there. So he says, Haridas Thakur says, the holy name is Chintamani, for it gives everything one desires. To the materialist, it gives dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And to the non-fruitive devotee, it gives pure love of Krishna. The holy name is unlimited, beginningless, inseparable, and is fully conscious. Why? Because Krishna himself. Whatever is in Krishna is in the holy name. For the two are non-different. The name is eternally free from all material contamination. And he goes on to say, Krishna and his form are non-different. Thus, the holy name and Krishna's form cannot be separated either. Darshan and hearing Bhagavatam, hearing Gita, chanting the holy name, they can't be separated. If one remembers Krishna's holy name, then he also receives Krishna's form. You notice what Haridas Thakur says. If one remembers Krishna's holy name, then he receives. We're not the doers, we're the receivers of Krishna's mercy. He receives Krishna's form. And by taking shelter of the primary holy name, one can realize all the attractive attributes of Supreme Lord, such as his beautiful form and his qualities and his pastime. So we know that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu totally emphasized this. That's why his only written instruction is the Shikshasakam. That through chanting of Hare Krishna Mahamantra, all the pastimes of the Lord will be revealed. And the holy name is what we actually, it's the the means and the end, and it also is the means of having darshan of the Lord. Because within it, within the form of sound, is the actual true form of the Lord. So I hope I've not caused confusion or distress. So the idea here is that by chanting the holy name, one enters into Golok Vrindavan, because the form of the Lord is within the name, as we described. And here's these beautiful deities. I've seen them in Ireland, and they're just so lovely. The Panchtattva, they just, Mahaprabhu's pleading with his hands down that please come and chant the holy name. So Prabhupada ki jai, Shishinatai Sacinandana ji ki jai, Lord Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. Please add more, correct, share your realizations if you have the desire. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji, for the beautiful lecture. And
Thank you.
this is Vivek. I'm subbing in for Narottam as Prabhuji. I really enjoyed the jam-packed session with so many instructions, especially about Sakshi Gopal.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of this before, even though you mentioned it, the famous pastime. But
Yes.
this is really to say that Lord never lets down his devotees.
Right.
Yeah.
Lord never lets down his devotees, and he reciprocates with the love within the devotee. And he's not made out of stone. He's not different than Rajendra Nandana Sut, the son of Nanda Maharaj. Yes, very good.
Yes, Prabhuji.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else have comments or questions or realizations that you have had while having darshan or chanting holy name? Thank you. So we will have darshan at the temple starting at 12:30. Today is a jam-packed day, 12:30 to 3:30. And please come with your family. Have darshan of Shishinatai Sacinandana. We do an annual deity welcoming ceremony in June of every year since the deities came to ISKCON Hillsborough, ISKCON Portland. And you're welcome to come, have darshan. Today we've modified the situation a little bit, given some decrease in COVID, that we will allow 40 people to come into temple at one particular time and stay longer for 20 minutes. We will have ongoing kirtan in the center of the temple, so there'll be no rules of staying within a box, etc. But everybody will be required to wear a mask. And those of you that have maybe elderly parents and don't feel comfortable, or you're just worried with your health about intermingling that closely, there'll be 3 boxes that'll be kept for families who want to kind of not take that risk of given what COVID has done to everybody in the world. So there'll be kirtan, there'll be darshan. Each group of 40 will be able to stay for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll bring the next group in, etc. And then you will be given prasadam to go. So we'll see how this goes, and hope that you are tolerant and come off, how we're trying to do it safely as possible. Okay. Questions on that, or pretty clear? Okay. Shri Vanchakalpatrubhyascha kripo sindhubhyo cha patitanam pavanabhyo